I just want to say thank you so much to MPAC for inviting me here, for doing the work that they do, and for inviting two families here who I would like to point out for some of you who weren't here for the earlier sessions. I was wondering if Ramiro Avelica Gonzalez would stand with his family. If they're still here, since they're little kids, they might be sleeping. And if Syed Jamal and his family would also stand. But earlier today, these two families spoke about their experiences. Ramiro Avelica Gonzalez was taking his two daughters to school with his wife almost 2 years ago now, just after Donald Trump became president. And he was pulled over by ICE. And as his 13-year-old daughter Fatima filmed on her cell phone, they took her father away as she wept. That cell phone video went viral. He was taken off to a for-profit prison, the Adelanto Detention Center, and held there for 6 months. From that prison, he said, "Every day I wake up knowing that I must be at least half as strong as my children have been in their fight for my freedom." He has 4 American-born daughters, Fatima and Julani and Jocelyn, who he interviewed on Democracy Now!, and Brenda. And he was then released because not of presidents or public officials, but because of movements fighting for his freedom, because of his incredibly brave daughters and wife fighting for his freedom. And then there's Syed Jamal, the chemistry professor from Kansas, who was also getting his kids ready for school just earlier this year when he was taken away by ICE. His brave children, Tassin and Nahin and Fareed Jamal, spoke out for their father, who was held for 54 days until, because his community, because of very diverse religious, ethnic, remarkable intersectional movement demanded his freedom, he was freed. Change doesn't come from the top. It is coming from the bottom up, and that is our hope for what is the remedy to what is happening in this country today. I think about the very moving speeches tonight of everyone and what happened just 2 weeks ago in Pittsburgh. 11 Jewish worshipers gunned down in synagogue. What isn't talked about as much is that this was the heart of the progressive Jewish community in Pittsburgh. Robert Bowers, the man accused of committing this heinous act, set out on, he didn't tweet this out, but just before he went in for the kill, he wrote a message online. You know, he uses this far-right website called Gab, a site frequented by neo-Nazis, white nationalists, and far-right users kicked off Twitter for racism or harassment. And he wrote, "Highest likes to bring invaders in that kill our people." Highest, formerly known as the Hebrew Immigrant Aid Society, who's been helping refugees for more than 130 years, Jewish and non-Jewish refugees resettle around the world, fleeing danger. Just the week before, one of the other congregations in the building of the Tree of Life Synagogue had held a refugee Shabbat, as hundreds of synagogues and congregations did all over this country, led by Hayas, to honor refugees. Hayas went to the border and does work on the border with Mexico to welcome refugees and help them resettle. And it was that combination of Jewish worshipers and those helping immigrants that Robert Bowers tried to destroy when he essentially quoted the President of the United States talking about the invaders that kill our people. That's the word that President Trump used to describe this caravan of persecuted, impoverished, desperate people making their way up from Honduras and some from Guatemala and El Salvador, attempting to save their own and their families' lives. He refers to them as invaders and said there are some Middle Easterners among them. When reporters challenged him in the White House and said, "Based on what are you saying this?" he said, "I have no evidence. I have no evidence." He doesn't even try to defend it now. "I have no evidence," he said. As the Yale historian Tim Snyder says, to abandon facts is to abandon freedom. And so Bowers went in and gunned down these worshipers, and particularly was incensed by this Jewish group, Hayas, that works with refugees. When President Trump said he wanted to come to Pittsburgh, the community said no, because President Trump didn't back off of using words like invader and invasion that threaten our people. No, he doubled and tripled and quadrupled down in the days that followed. Just like in the week before, when something like 14 or 15 letter bombs were sent to what looked like a Trump hit list, right? The people that Trump so enjoys criticizing. The Obamas, the Clintons, Eric Holder, Maxine Waters, George Soros, Tom Steyer. He continued to attack these very people as the bombs were being sent, including CNN, who received 3 of these letter bombs, continued to talk about them, the media, as the enemy of the American people, fueling the fire. Think about this. This was all happening in just the month of October. And at the same time, October 2nd, Jamal Khashoggi goes into the Saudi embassy, the Saudi consulate in Istanbul, Turkey, and is murdered by what's believed now to be at least a 15-man hit team that strangled him, dismembered him. We still don't know where his body or body parts are. And here is Trump is talking about the terrorists who threaten this country from the outside. When asked what he was going to do about this, on whose orders was this done, he said, "We will wait for Saudi Arabia to investigate itself." And as this journalist, this Washington Post columnist, is murdered, and lie upon lie is revealed that the Saudi regime told, President Trump flies to Montana for a campaign rally, and he applauds a congressman, Gianforte, who had been found guilty of criminally assaulting a Guardian reporter named Ben Jacobs. Right before he was elected last year, this Congress member body slammed this reporter to the ground. So in the midst of the Khashoggi horror, he goes to Montana to applaud this American congressman who had criminally assaulted a reporter and said, he's my kind of guy. This month of October into November saw the letter bombs by a crazed Trump supporter. You know, the police found him in his van with all his Trump stickers on it. And then 2 African Americans were killed in the Louisville area in Kentucky, as the gunman reportedly said as he pulled the trigger on these 2 men, a man and woman, he had just come from trying to get into a black church, but it was locked. He couldn't reach the people inside to kill. As he's running out of the grocery store where he killed them, an armed white man was standing, and he said, "Whites don't kill whites," the murderer said. And then we move on to what happened in Pittsburgh. And I wanted to read a quote of a guest we had on Democracy Now! Named Dr. David Glosser, who is a retired neuropsychologist who volunteered with HIAS, helped resettle refugees in the Philadelphia area. He wrote a piece in Politico magazine headlined, "Stephen Miller is an immigration hypocrite. I know because I'm his uncle." Stephen Miller, the senior advisor to President Trump, who is the architect of President Trump's fierce anti-immigrant policies right through to today, as he issues executive order after intention and proposal to shut down the border, to prevent anyone from coming over the border outside a port of entry, as he talks about stripping the policy of birthright citizenship and ending it. Stephen Miller is at the heart of all of this. His uncle wrote in Politico that Stephen Miller would not even be here if it weren't for what's called chain migration by the Trump administration, right? Family members bringing others from other countries, that his family would never have survived the pogroms or the Holocaust if they hadn't been allowed to come into this country. So we had David Glosser on right after the Pittsburgh massacre. And after he shared his condolences to the families, the relatives, he said, "My many friends, and specifically the Squirrel Hill region," he said, "we have now been subject to the consequences of our political leaders abandoning their moral responsibilities. The question has been asked, what happens when hate speech becomes legitimized and it becomes acceptable in our political discourse to condemn and vilify innocent people on the basis of race, religion, national origin, or color? The answer has made itself very clear in the last few days, in the last week, with the pipe bomb attacks upon political opponents of Mr. Trump. Mr. Trump has made it his policy to vilify and dehumanize Hispanics, Muslims, non-whites, calling them subhuman animals that are infesting our country like so many insects or rats. Make no mistake about it, this is the same kind of propaganda that is identical to the racist rants at Nazi Party rallies in Germany in the 30s. Now Trump spews the same poisonous messages to his supporters and claims innocence when the inflammatory vitriol is sprayed over society. He claims innocence now that this political gasoline catches fire and people get hurt and killed. Dr. Glosser went on to say, I'm horrified by it. I'd love to say I was surprised, but I'm not. More shockingly, the Republican Congress, he said, has tolerated his vilification. Where have been their cries of outrage? They're the so-called responsible people in our country in positions of political leadership. Their silence has been deafening. I would say that this silence tends to legitimize the crazy conspiracy theories, the hate speech, the threats, the violent acts of the most noxious white nationalist elements of the American political spectrum. Mr. Trump is even unashamed to tell us that among the chanting Nazis in Charlottesville, there were many fine people, drawing a false moral equivalency between those protesting against these kinds of actions and the Nazis themselves. Should we now be surprised that well-armed white nationalist bigots, isolated, friendless loners seeking validation for their empty lives, that they act out on their hate? I think not, he said. He said, now, Mr. Trump didn't pull the trigger in the synagogue. He didn't mail those bombs, but for the first time in 50 years, he's made bigoted hate speech in America a legitimate tool of political manipulation. His endless barrage of excited hatred, threats, and lies has consequences, as we have seen. He said, I regard Mr. Trump as a hopeless moral imbecile, indifferent to the deadly consequences of his inflammatory conduct. Again, these the words of Dr. David Glosser, the uncle of Stephen Miller. And he's not the only one who has criticized Trump's senior advisor and Trump himself. Stephen Miller's rabbi in the High Holy Days at the synagogue where he grew up, right here in California, in San Diego, also attacks Stephen Miller by name. Because we are talking about a fundamental change in America right now. I mean, make no mistake about it. President Obama oversaw the deportation of millions and millions and millions of immigrants, right? Even his closest immigrant rights allies who worked inside and outside the White House ended up calling President Obama the deporter-in-chief. But President Trump has brought this to a whole new level, not only intensifying the deportations, but vilifying not only Latin Americans, Hispanics, Muslims, Jews, women. How many women has President Trump been accused of sexually assaulting? And then he tells us one of the main reasons he wants to stop this caravan is to protect our women in the United States. Because, as you know, he launched his campaign by talking about Mexican rapists. And then, even closer to home right here, after the Pittsburgh massacre, it is just hard to believe this has all taken place in this concentrated amount of time. But President Trump has ripped open the belly of the beast. And within days of this massacre of 11 Jewish worshipers, on November 2nd, a group of women and a man going for a yoga class in Tallahassee, Florida, where President Obama had just gone that afternoon for a campaign rally. President Obama for Andrew Gillum and Senator Nelson. An hour after this, a man walks into a yoga studio and guns down the people inside, killing 2 women, a doctor and a 21-year-old journalism student at Florida State. Another woman he shoots 9 times, she survives, and shoots altogether something like 5 other people, women. Clearly a man who, in his rants on social media, despises women, one of these incels and voluntary celibates, which seems to be, when you look at this rash of killings, these young, white, supremacist, misogynist, Islamophobic, anti-Semitic, racist men, while each may be called a loner, they are part of a growing kind of insurrection. It's how they see themselves in this country that feel somehow legitimized by the hate that's being spewed by officialdom, by the leaders of this country, primarily the President of the United States. But it's not hopeless right now. It's horrific, but not hopeless, because it's really not about the president. It's up to all of you, and you are far more powerful than that one man in the White House who has redefined the White House, than that one person who occupies the most powerful position on earth. No, it's movements in this country, in the most powerful country on earth, that are the only answer. And then it comes very close to home when just this week in Thousand Oaks, you know what took place. 11 Jewish worshipers killed 2 weeks ago, and this surpasses that? I mean, this is just astounding. A man, an Afghanistan veteran, a Marine, not clear if he's suffering from PTSD, but clear he lived at his mother's house. There were cases of domestic violence, and in more than half of these cases, the first signs are violence against women in their past, no matter how young they are. Even in the Parkland massacre, this young man stalking a woman who he ends up killing that day among the students, the 17 staff and students at Parkland. And if violence against women were taken seriously from the beginning, when police are called to the Parkland killer's home, 39, 49 times, and he is still allowed to legally have guns? And in this case in Thousand Oaks, it appears, and it's still very sketchy, that police were called to his home, that his mother was terrified of him, and that police were called to his home a few months ago, and mental health professionals were brought in, but they assessed he could continue. But why? Why didn't this trigger the red flag laws of California? Why was he allowed to continue to legally own a gun? And then we see what took place. A man who had been flagged before. And when we flew in just last night, this morning, today, as we were flying into California, reading the stories of the survivors and the people killed, the idea that there were some who survived the Las Vegas Country Music Festival massacre that killed 59, a crazed gunman who died in this massacre, or those that survived and now have to flee their homes because of these deadly wildfires, the worst in this state's history. So how does this connect to President Trump? Well, it certainly goes back before him, but the denial of climate change and what we can do about it. These communities, your communities, are so hard hit. I understand some people couldn't come tonight because they were evacuating their homes. But the idea that President Trump threatened even to not give California federal aid around this issue of what's happening in the state, knowing some of the worst droughts over the years. Climate change is such an incredibly serious issue, not only for California, not only for this country, but around the world. And President Trump calling it a Chinese hoax. If only that's all it were. But the situation you have here today with these deadly fires, we just were in Florida covering the Panhandle, floods, the hurricane that hit, the leveling of whole communities, and they are intimately connected to what's happening in California. But people aren't going to know these disparate weather conditions are connected unless the media talks about climate change, when they talk about flooding, when they talk about hurricanes, and what seems like the opposite, these out-of-control wildfires. It's why I continually say, we're not just talking about Fox. MSNBC and CNN will go to 24-hour coverage of the weather, which they should in these cases. They'll flash the words severe weather, they'll flash the words extreme weather, but they never flash the words climate change or global warming. And that's what people need to know to take action, because there is something we can do about it. And I would not just say it's the solution that somehow the state of California has come up with, and that is prisoners fighting these fires. And I just wanted to make a comment about this. A few weeks ago, we broadcast from California, from San Francisco for the week, covering all the climate summit activities of Governor Brown and the protests outside. But then we went an hour north from San Francisco to what seemed like an interesting facility. It was called the Delta Conservation Camp. But this camp was a prison. It's one of 44 prisons around California. 40 of them are for men, 3 of them are for women, and 1 of them are for juveniles. And many of you may know this story, but 25%, between 20 and 25% of the firefighting forces of California are prisoners. They are incarcerated firefighters. It's an absolutely astounding story. The sergeants and the guards there talk about how critical they are. Jerry Brown has applauded them. We talked to one sergeant who said the inmate firefighters are the backbone of CAL FIRE. They get the toughest assignment there is. As one sergeant told us, they get the toughest assignments in the worst conditions, 110 degrees in the middle of the sun, wearing 2 layers of clothing, carrying 40 pounds of gear. Then they have to carry all their food and water for a 24-hour shift. Governor Brown said, I want to personally thank the thousands of inmates who are also on the line fighting to protect lives and bring these fires to a quick close. The prison firefighters make $1 an hour. They save California up to $100 million per year by official estimates. Even the Delta Camp commander, Lieutenant Sid Turner, told us, I believe they should make more than $1 an hour. He said they've been at that rate for many, many decades. He said, I think back to the 1960s. He admitted that if the prison population were to decline, the firefighting system would be challenged. He said California needs the prisoners to fight the fires. If we don't have the inmates to perform that function, they've got to find the labor from someplace else. And CAL FIRE, as you know, is running out of money because of how desperate the situation is. So I asked one of the prisoners, well, how do you feel about this? And he said, well, we make $1 an hour if we're fighting the fires, and if we're waiting to fight the fires, we make $1.45 a day. When I asked what he thought of some describing the wages as slave labor, he laughed nervously with the guard looking on and said, I don't really want to call the work slave work, but we're getting paid $1 an hour. Why do the prisoners do it? Why are they risking their lives? Well, a number of them told us a key incentive to engage in this dangerous work is to receive time off their sentences. They get 2 days off their prison sentence for each day at a firefighting camp. Now, remarkably, I mean, they're getting unbelievable training, I guess you could say, but remarkably, after fighting wildfires for years, after risking their lives for years, these prisoners are prevented from working as firefighters when they are free because they're ex-felons. So, we covered these protests and went to the prison camps. The protests, part of a global day of action, demanding action on climate change, but central to the modern day climate change movement is the concept of environmental justice, addressing how climate change impacts communities differently based on race, economic status, and gender. Nowhere is this more clear than the fire lines in California, where thousands of prisoners, mostly poor people of color, get paid slave wages to risk their lives by fighting raging fires made more frequent and more intense by climate change. There were thousands of people protesting in San Francisco, many of them led by indigenous activists, because Native Americans have been on the forefront of this battle to save the planet for all of us. And I wanted to tell this brief story because it's so important, although it's getting late. But I wanted to end with the standoff at Standing Rock, because as we talk about movements to save the planet, we cannot underestimate the power and visionary protest of Native Americans and what they did in the midst of the 2016 election year in fighting the Dakota Access Pipeline, owned by Energy Transfer Partners in North Dakota. I don't know if you followed the news on all of the voting in this midterm election that was so important. I don't know if you followed this news, but in North Dakota, the state tried to prevent thousands of Native Americans from voting by saying that they couldn't use their tribal IDs. You know, all over the country, these laws are just astounding that prevent people from using standard IDs, but you can use gun licenses, not school ID. And in North Dakota, the Native Americans were not going to be allowed to use their tribal IDs. But 2016 was the year that shook this country around climate change, because Native Americans in North Dakota took a stand. The Standing Rock Sioux, April 1st, 2016, the unofficial historian of the Standing Rock Sioux Reservation is a woman named LaDonna Brave Bull Allard. And she said she'd open her property to the resistance to DAPL, the Dakota Access Pipeline, a $3.8 billion project that would, they call it the Black Snake, snake its way from the North Dakota back in oil fields, taking fracked oil from North Dakota through South Dakota, Iowa, Illinois, then to the Gulf of Mexico. And the people said no. And she said, anyone who come to resist, you can stay at my property. And she thought a couple dozen people would come. Well, needless to say, not only hundreds, but thousands of Native and non-Native people came from all over the world. It was the largest unification of Native tribes from South America, the United States, the First Nations of Canada, to protest petropolitics, these pipeline politics. They didn't want the Dakota Access Pipeline to be dug under the Missouri River, the longest river in North America, endangering the water supply of 17 million people, native and non-native. And they built one resistance camp after another. Democracy Now! Went there Labor Day weekend of 2016, right before the elections. In the major election debates, you know that not one of the news personalities, I hesitate to call them journalists, who moderated the debates asked a question about climate change. Not one. Not one question, let alone Standing Rock. But we went Labor Day weekend, and we saw these amazing protests, older women in traditional garb, girls, boys, older men, standing off against these fully militarized rural sheriff's departments. You know the scene of these departments, these police departments and sheriff's departments, when they've got MRAPs and tanks, and they've got automatic weapons and tear gas and mace. You know it from Ferguson. Right after the killing of Mike Brown a few years ago, his body left to bake in the hot August sun, hour after hour after hour, killed by a white police officer. The people rose up, and they were met by the St. Louis and suburban police departments, fully armed and weaponized. This is recycling in America today. You take the weapons from Iraq and Afghanistan, and you give them to the police departments of the United States. And they turn them on their own people, their own neighbors, their own citizens. And this is what we saw in the back roads of North Dakota. I mean, they would have water ceremonies before they faced off against the police, offering the police water too, saying, this is for your children, not just ours. We're trying to save this for all of us, before they would be gassed and arrested and beaten. So we followed one group of Native Americans who are planting their tribal flags on an area that they had designated as their sacred burial ground. A judge was about to rule on the Dakota Access Pipeline, and he said, if you say this is your sacred burial ground, give me a map. Prove it to me, which they did. And he gave it to the other side, as judges do. And as they were about to plant their flags, they saw the bulldozers moving in. This was a holiday weekend. They did not expect them to be excavating and destroying the property for the pipeline. And they believed that the Dakota Access Pipeline Company used the map that they were given by the judge, and they leapfrogged their bulldozers forward to destroy the area before the judge ruled, so it would be moot. The facts would change on the ground. And it was amazing to see the bravery of the people standing in front of these bulldozers, led by women and girls. As I looked at this, and as we filmed, the Democracy Now! Team filmed, I could only think about back to right before the Iraq War, 3 days before, March 16, 2003, another place in the Middle East. It was in Gaza. And it was a young American woman named Rachel Corrie from Evergreen College, who had gone to Gaza with the International Solidarity Movement and other activists, and had befriended a Palestinian pharmacist family. And an Israeli military bulldozer was coming to demolish this home. And so the activists stood in front of the home, the Israeli military bulldozer made by Caterpillar in the United States. And Rachel donned one of those construction vests, orange fluorescent vests, and they stood in front of the house. She stood in front of this bulldozer, and the bulldozer crushed her to death. And that's what I thought about. You can't underestimate, these are earth-crushing machines, mammoth machines, and these women and girls are standing in front of them. But this time, the bulldozers pulled back. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 of them pulling back, and the people moved forward, and more Native Americans came from the resistance camps, and they marched forward. And the guards, they were forced to move back. The bulldozers were moving back, and that's when the guards unleashed dogs on the Native Americans. Dogs. They were biting they didn't call themselves protesters, they called themselves water protectors. They were biting the water protectors. I love dogs. And you could see these guards throwing the dogs into the crowd of water protectors, and they would bite their way out. These dogs were trained to maim. We filmed a dog with its mouth and nose covered in blood. Finally, though, despite the fact they were beaten, they were bitten, they were gassed, they were maced, they prevailed, the Native Americans. And finally, the guards took their dogs, the bulldozers moved back, and they left. They prevailed at a ridiculously high price, but the Native Americans, the resistance, won that day. We posted that video online that night, and it went viral. Within 24 hours, 14 million views. We went back to New York and covered the protests, continued to cover the protests. On Thursday, the governor of North Dakota, his name was Governor Dalrymple at the time, called out the National Guard because the next day the judge would rule, and it didn't look good for the tribe. This was under President Obama. And they also issued, I didn't know this at the time, but an arrest warrant for me. On Friday morning, we did our show, and then Nermeen Sheikh and I flew to Toronto. We weren't fleeing. We didn't go to Canada because we knew about this, but it was the Toronto International Film Festival, and they were showing a film about independent journalism based on the muckraking journalist I.F. Stone. Some of you folks may remember him, who told young people, teaching them about journalism, if you can remember 2 words, remember governments lie. If you can remember 3 words, remember all governments lie. And then they were talking about journalistic organizations that follow in I.F. Stone's footsteps, and they profiled Democracy Now!, so they asked us to come speak afterwards, which we did. And the next day, we went to the University of Toronto. There were hundreds of people there. We gave speeches. In the midst of the speech, I got a text on my phone. Oh, my God, I see how late it is. I'll wrap up in 5 minutes. And it said, "You're under arrest." I thought it was someone in the audience. It was some kind of scam. I thought, this must be a joke. But I saw it was a North Dakota number. And I had no idea what was going on, but I knew this was serious. And some of you may have experienced this. But if there is an arrest warrant for you, I mean, you don't immediately get arrested, but if you have interaction with the FBI or police or border guards, they will pick you up. And I thought if I could get back over the border, I had to go home. I was in Canada. Before the arrest warrant went into the system, at least I could be home. So I just looked out on the crowd and I said, could someone call me a cab? And I didn't tell them what had happened. I raced to the airport and I was able to get back to New York. And yes, in fact, this was true. They had issued an arrest warrant for me, and I thought this was just simply a way of bullying, a way of sending a message to all journalists, do not go to North Dakota, which is exactly why we all had to go. And so a few weeks later, we went back to North Dakota as the protest got bigger, and I really felt it was important for young independent journalists to know you don't have to get a record when you put things on the record. So we flew back to North Dakota. As we landed, calling the bluff of the authorities, the prosecutors announced they were quashing the arrest warrant for me. Oh, but they would make it more serious. They would charge me with felony riot. What, like I was a one-woman riot? What were they talking about? So I called my North Dakota lawyer, not that I had one before, and I said, what does this mean? What do I face? And he said, it's not the worst thing in the world, maybe a year in prison. A year. So I said, how much time do I have? He said, 2 days. On Monday, you will be arraigned. So that gave me 2 more days to cover the protest. Monday morning, the show must go on. So we got a broadcast truck from Minneapolis, broadcast from Mandan, North Dakota, in front of the courthouse and the jail and the 10 Commandments in between. And then I would turn myself in. And we interviewed the head of the Standing Rock Sioux, the 45th chairman of the Standing Rock Sioux, Dr. Dave Archambault, just like President Trump is the 45th president of the United States. And I asked our Chief Archambault, did you ever get arrested? He said, I did, for protesting this. And I said, he said, a low-level misdemeanor. And I said, and what happened? He said, I was strip searched, I was put in an orange jumpsuit, and I was jailed. The 45th chairman of the Standing Rock Sioux. I mean, that's interesting. I mean, if that happened to the 45th president of the United States, it would match orange jumpsuit. And then I asked Dr. Sarah Jumping Eagle, the pediatrician of the Standing Rock Reservation, was she ever arrested? She was one of the first because she cared about the health of the children. I said, what happened to you? She said, low-level misdemeanor. She said, I was strip searched, I was put in an orange jumpsuit, and I was jailed. I mean, how much humiliation can a people take? After the show, I was going to be arraigned at 1:30. Hundreds of Native Americans came to show solidarity, and then I got a call from North Dakota Public Radio, a guy who'd been there for decades, knew all the players, said they're not going to dare bring these charges against you because all the media was covering a journalist about to be arrested. I mean, the New York Times, Al Jazeera, the homepage of BBC, Los Angeles Times, Vogue magazine was covering this. And they said the judge will not sign off on these charges. And not only for me, but for Native Americans who were facing felony and misdemeanor charges that day. A number of them had them dropped. This is what happens when the media shines the spotlight in the right direction, right? This is the kind of reality TV we all have to support. Not the kind that the president stars in, but the kind that shows the reality of people's lives on the ground. This is absolutely critical that we support independent media. And I'll just end by saying that what happened this week with the midterm elections is a true turning point. I mean, you have so many firsts. You have the first 2 Muslim women who will be going to Congress. You have Rashida Tlaib and Ilhan Omar. And I don't know how many of you heard Ilhan Omar's acceptance speech, her victory speech, when she talked about her own firsts. Not only is she the first Muslim woman to be going to Congress, along with Rashida Tlaib, she is the first Somali American woman, the first hijab-wearing woman, and she is the first refugee to be represented in Congress. You have 2 Native American women who talk about, I just interviewed Deb Haaland from New Mexico, first Native women in Congress, and she was at Standing Rock, and they talk about how that activism at Standing Rock inspired them to reach new heights and to deeply fight for the environment. And so many of the new crop of firsts, 100 women will now serve simply in the House of Representatives, and it may be more. 100 women for the first time. 2 Latina women from Texas, the first time Latina women will represent Texas in the House of Representatives. You have the first gay male governor in the country, openly gay governor, Jared Polis, from Colorado. I mean, one after another, records are being broken. And of course, Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez in New York, the youngest woman ever in the U.S. House of Representatives. And what so many of them are representing is $15 an hour minimum wage, is talking about free college education. So many of them are talking about the issue of climate change, addressing inequality, and talking about a just foreign policy. There is so much more to talk about, but what's absolutely critical now is that this is just the beginning. These midterm elections have made an enormous difference. Among them in Florida, an amendment, Amendment 4, is one of the largest enfranchisements of people since women got the right to vote 100 years ago. It's called Amendment 4. 1.4 million Floridians can now vote in the next election because Florida voted overwhelmingly to allow people who have felonies on their records and have served their time, whether or not they served time in prison, have said that they can vote. 1 in 3 African American men could not vote in Florida. It's an astounding story. It's a model that should be followed all over this country. Think about it. George Bush versus Al Gore, he won by 500 votes, President Bush. President Trump won by 115,000 votes in Florida. We're talking 1.4 million new voters in just this one state. There have been remarkable strides made this week. Even in the midst of the horror, there is hope. But most importantly, it is just the beginning. President Trump, quite literally and figuratively, represents a wall. But that wall has now become a door. Whether it's kicked open or slammed shut depends on all of you in this room and people all over this country. I want to end by going back to World War II and just saying, there was a brother and sister named Hans and Sophie Scholl. They weren't Jewish, they were German Christians, but they thought, what can we do in the face of the Nazi atrocity? And together with their professor and other students and workers, they formed the White Rose Collective. And they decided to put out a series of pamphlets so the Germans would never be able to say we didn't know. One of those pamphlets said across it, "We will not be silent." They distributed these pamphlets everywhere. They would hurl them into marketplaces in the middle of the night, in alleyways, in college campuses, at high schools and elementary schools. They got the word out. And then Hans and Sophie and their professor were captured. They were charged, they were tried, they were convicted, and they were beheaded. But that philosophy, that motto should be the Hippocratic Oath of all journalists today, should be the Hippocratic Oath of all of us today. We will not be silent. Democracy now.